Welcome to the Tactical Games. I'm James Gill. Today I'm talking about optic selection for the tactical games. A couple of things that we've talked about briefly and are most important for the tactical games is your optic selection. Whether you go with a 1 power or a variable power, I can tell you the pitfalls to each of those. This is my setup that I've been running for the last couple of years for tac games. I've been shooting a 1:6, which works extremely well for me. Now, as you're going through and making your selection on optics, things that you want to consider. Do you have to shoot a 1 power? No, you don't. I can tell you over the years I've shot a fixed 1 power, and it's nice for short range target acquisitions, but I'm limited by what I can see at distance on targets. Most of us have moved to a variable power optic, whether it's a 1:6, 1:8, or even a 1:10, and now competitors are starting to talk about 3:16 or 3:18, something like that. I can tell you on the optic selection, the first thing that I'm going to look for is, am I going to buy this optic more than once during the season? As you look at my rifle here, it's pretty beat up. I am not gentle with my equipment. So if you go to a gun shop and you handle an optic and it breaks on you and it's a $150 optic, it may work in your budget, but you're probably going to end up buying a couple of them. So as we go through, things to think about are the quality of the optic first and foremost. And then what am I using that for in tactical games? So typically we've been shooting precise targets at distance, and I have to be able to see those targets. So I want an optic that's going to be extremely clear. And if you have good eyesight, then a 1:4 or 1:6 may work for you. If you hard of seeing or you're getting a little older, whatever the case is, you might want some more magnification, but you're going to have a trade-off there. So at 1:6 at max magnification, when I'm really looking at a small target, my field of vision is restricted to about 124 feet. That might not sound like a big deal, but if you're on the line with 4 or 5 other shooters trying to find your target as you're shooting through a port, that smaller field of vision is going to choke and restrict what you can see on target. The other issue with shooting at max magnification on shorter range targets is you're going to see a little bit of your wobble in the optic, and you might be a little hesitant to pull the trigger. So you're going to start playing with it. The next thing we're going to look at is the optic or the reticle selection. Many of you may have been familiar with a general reticle optic or just a generic reticle. Those work just fine until you start applying things like holdovers and trying to hold a precise area on the target. Most of us will shoot something like a ballistic drop compensator or a BDC reticle of some sort, or a MIL or an MOA reticle. And each of those will have their own advantages and disadvantages. For example, I spent 12 years in the Marine Corps. I can count to 10 very easily, so MILS works for me. MOA doesn't, because it's fractions that I don't even want to think about. But you can, either one of those you can play with. Now, when going with something like a ballistic or a BDC reticle, it's going to have a ballistic formula that's done by the factory, and it may not work exactly for you. So what the manufacturer does is they take a bullet weight and a bullet velocity, and they pre-design that reticle for that bullet drop. Something like a MIL reticle is going to be generic marking lines, and you're going to have to do the ballistic equation yourself to know what your holds are. So in the case where I'm running a BDC reticle, when I go to shoot at 300 yards, I don't have to hold in some obscure area. I go to my third stadia line, which is clearly marked with a 3, and I hold there. Now, in the world of precision, it's close enough, but it's not 100% spot on accuracy. So with a BDC reticle, I have to true my data out and know when I shoot at 300 yards, my hold and where the bullet impacts might not be perfect. To be really precise, something like a MIL reticle will be more precise for you as long as you're inputting all the correct information. As we're going through those reticles, not every optic or optic manufacturer will have the same reticle choices for you. Typically your MOA and your MIL reticles are kind of standard, but then you'll start seeing specialty reticles like an H58 or H59, Tremor 2, Tremor 3. And some of those, like MIL reticle here is a pretty standard item. As you start looking at something like a Christmas tree reticle, it can be very busy when you first start looking at it, but then it makes sense as you go and you start doing the math on where you're holding. So as you're going through those reticles, you're gonna have to pick what works for you. Like I said, I'm running a BDC, it works well for me. If I was playing a PRS game or something of that nature, I would be shooting a true mill reticle or a Christmas tree reticle. The next thing we want to talk about is turrets. The turrets for the tactical games have been something that has eaten a lot of people's lunch over the years. In previous years where we're used to sling rifles and we're moving through a very dynamic environment, having turrets that are open and exposed could cause problems where you might inadvertently roll those turrets when you don't want them to. And then you go to shoot on target and you're shooting way left or whatever the case is. So closed turrets or locking turrets have been very helpful. It's extremely rare in the tactical games that we're dialing on a stage. Most of the time we have a known distance target and we can either hold over according to that or set our turrets in place if you want to dial ahead of time. But we recommend that you have a locking turret or a closed turret so you don't inadvertently move your turrets throughout the day. And if for whatever reason you don't have a locking turret, you can do the old trick with a paint marker and just move over it. That way, if something happens and you do bump that turret, you can look down at it quickly and see that you're off your setting. With a locking turret, anytime I change my zero, anytime I change my information, I will actually float the turret so it's always set in that locking position. It's extremely rare that I'm making any adjustments on my optic at all. The next thing we want to talk about is illuminated optics. In the case for short range or fast shooting, you definitely want to have illumination so that your eye is very quickly attracted to what you're looking for in the reticle on target. You're not always shooting at 6 yards, and if you are, you can kind of just point your rifle generically at it and be good enough. But a red dot does help attract your eye to the reticle very quickly. Now, when we're shooting longer range and precision targets, you're gonna have a little more time, so you don't necessarily have to have the illumination, but there's a variety of illuminated reticles that will only illuminate if your eye is set in the eye box. So when you're doing your long range precision shooting, if your head moves left to right in that eye box, you might not be on target. As we're talking about the optic choices, things that you need to think about when setting up your optic. The eye relief is probably the most important thing with setting the optic for you, the individual shooter. So there is no optic that is a one size fits all. We have a general spec of at max magnification, that cone coming back from the optic to your eye. It's basically a little traffic cone. And at roughly 2.5, 2 3/4 inches, changes depending on your optic, that's where you're gonna have the cleanest vision for your target. So when you mount your optic, you want to set the eye relief to you. And typically we do that when we're in a prone position. That's going to be your most high value position, because when you're standing, it's very easy to move your head to the optic and position. But when you're prone, you don't want to be crunched up and moving around behind the gun. So setting your eye relief so that you get comfortable on the optic and you're seeing the same picture every time is extremely important. Now, when you go from something like a 1 power optic, where there's virtually no parallax or no eye box, you can kind of be anywhere behind that optic and still see the center of the dot. On a variable power optic, you're going to have a definitive eye box. So something like a 1:6, your eye box is going to be a little more generous than a 1:10. So as you're setting that eye relief, that's something you want to take into consideration. As we're going through and making our optic selections, again, as you're going through and looking at your budget and what you're doing, don't be afraid to spend a little more to get a quality optic.